The early morning hum of activity filled the boarding gate for the Phoenix to Los Angeles flight. Passengers shuffled forward in organized lines, clutching coffee cups and carry-ons, their faces a blend of fatigue and quiet determination. This was the first-class boarding group, an exclusive pocket of travelers moving with restrained energy. Among them was a man who stood out, not for his tailored navy suit or polished leather shoes, but for his palpable air of self-importance. In his mid-40s, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and dominance. His leather briefcase swung in rhythm with his purposeful stride, and his sharp gaze swept over the other passengers with thinly veiled disinterest. He settled into his first-class seat, the picture of modern success, scrolling through his tablet as the rest of the passengers filed in. That's when he noticed him, an older man slowly making his way down the aisle, clutching a modest bag. The older man was a stark contrast to the businessman. Dressed in a tan jacket, a plaid shirt, and worn loafers, he exuded an air of simplicity. His weathered face carried a calmness that spoke of a life lived fully, yet without the need for validation. He quietly took his seat by the window, adjusted his jacket, and gazed outside. To most, he might have seemed unremarkable, but the businessman saw him as an anomaly. Leaning slightly toward the older man, he smirked. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he remarked loud enough for others nearby to hear. The older man didn't react, offering only the faintest of smiles before returning his gaze to the tarmac. Irritated by the lack of response, the businessman pressed on. "What's the occasion? Charity upgrade?" His tone dripped with condescension. Again, there was no reaction. The older man adjusted his seatbelt, his calm composure amplifying the businessman's growing frustration. As the plane taxied and climbed into the skies, the businessman couldn't let it go. Something about the older man's serene demeanor unsettled him. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of quiet confidence that stood in stark opposition to the businessman's need to assert superiority. Once they reached cruising altitude, the businessman decided to push further. Loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, he quipped, "Let me guess, big lottery win? Or maybe you're here reminiscing about the good old days when planes had propellers." This time passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their glances darting toward the older man. He didn't flinch, instead folding his hands in his lap and adjusting the cuff of his jacket. A subtle but unmistakable dismissal of the businessman's antics. Undeterred, the businessman turned to another passenger, gesturing toward the older man. "You ever notice how people like him always talk about the past? No smartphones, no innovation. They act like the world was better back then. Nostalgia, right? The world's moved on, thankfully." A few passengers exchanged uneasy looks, but no one intervened. The businessman leaned back, satisfied with his performance, until the flight attendant approached with the beverage cart. She stopped at the older man's row and spoke with warm deference. "Mr. Eastwood, would you like coffee or tea?" The businessman froze, the words hitting him like a thunderclap. "Eastwood?" The older man turned toward the flight attendant with a polite smile. "Coffee. Black," he said, his calm voice carrying the weight of familiarity. Realization swept over the businessman. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend. The man he'd been mocking wasn't some unassuming retiree. He was an icon, synonymous with resilience and strength. A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. "Is that Clint Eastwood?" a woman murmured. "It has to be," her husband replied, craning his neck. The businessman's face paled. His tablet slipped onto his lap as he pieced it all together. The older man's composed silence suddenly made sense. It wasn't the quiet of someone insignificant. It was the confidence of someone who didn't need to prove a thing. Summoning his courage, the businessman leaned forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice now subdued and uncertain. Eastwood turned slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto the businessman. It wasn't an angry look, but it carried a quiet authority that stopped the younger man in his tracks. "Yes?" Eastwood replied simply. The businessman opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? Sorry for being an arrogant fool? His bravado evaporated, leaving only the sting of his own humiliation. The plane hummed along, passengers watching as Clint Eastwood turned back to his coffee, unfazed, leaving the businessman to stew in the lesson of humility he hadn't known he needed. I didn't realize, the businessman stammered, his words faltering. His voice trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Eastwood raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable as he waited. The silence only deepened the businessman's discomfort. I didn't mean to offend you, the man finally whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't realize who you were. For the first time, a flicker of amusement danced across Eastwood's face. He set his coffee cup down on the tray table, leaning back in his seat. And if I wasn't who you think I am? Eastwood asked, his tone calm but cutting. The businessman blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? Eastwood tilted his head slightly, his steady gaze never breaking. If I were just some ordinary guy in a plaid shirt, would that make the way you spoke to me acceptable? The businessman's mouth opened, but no words came out. The question struck him harder than he expected, leaving him momentarily stunned. Around them, the low murmur of conversation in the cabin quieted as curious passengers began to take notice. Even the flight attendants slowed, their attention shifting toward the unfolding exchange. I guess not, the businessman finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Eastwood gave a slight nod, as if the answer had confirmed what he already knew. Without another word, he picked up his coffee and turned back toward the window, effectively ending the conversation. For Eastwood, the moment was over, but for the businessman, it was far from finished. Eastwood's calm, pointed words lingered in the air, wrapping around him like a mirror reflecting his arrogance and assumptions back at him. The businessman sat frozen, replaying the moment in his head. He wanted to apologize again, to find the right words to undo the damage, but his confidence, so bold earlier, had completely deserted him. Finally, after a long silence, he leaned forward, his voice tentative. Mr. Eastwood, I owe you an apology. I wasn't trying to... Eastwood held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. His expression remained calm, but his tone was firm. You don't need to explain. What's done is done. But there's a lesson here if you're willing to hear it. The businessman nodded quickly, eager for redemption. Around them, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the passengers listening as though Eastwood's words were meant for them too. Eastwood leaned back, cradling his coffee cup. People like to think respect is something you earn by being important. Having a title, a reputation, he began, his voice steady with the weight of experience. But real respect, that's not about who the other person is. It's about who you are. The businessman felt those words hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth, but no response came. The truth in Eastwood's words was undeniable, stripping away the man's excuses before they could even form. Respect isn't conditional, Eastwood continued. It's not something you hand out based on appearances, status, or recognition. It's about how you carry yourself, how you treat people, even when you think no one's watching. The businessman flushed, shame rising in his chest. His life had been built on achievements, status, and power. Yet here he was, being humbled by the most fundamental lesson in decency from a man he had arrogantly dismissed. Eastwood took another sip of his coffee and set the cup down. I've seen a lot in my time. People love to make quick judgments, to think they've got someone figured out at first glance. But those assumptions? He shook his head slightly. They say more about the person making them than the person they're about. The businessman swallowed hard, unable to meet Eastwood's gaze. His mind raced, recalling other moments in his life where he had dismissed or judged people based on shallow metrics. Colleagues, strangers, even friends, all reduced in his mind to what they could do for him or how they fit into his world. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Eastwood added, his tone softening. I'm telling you because I hope you'll think about it next time. Next time you look at someone and decide they're worth less than you. The cabin was completely still. Eastwood turned back toward the window, his demeanor calm and detached, as if the moment had passed for him. But for the businessman, those words lingered. He sat in silence, his thoughts swirling. He realized how often he had let arrogance and assumptions dictate his interactions. The weight of his own behavior bore down on him, leaving no escape from the uncomfortable truth Eastwood had revealed. As the plane began its descent, the businessman resolved to do better. Eastwood's words weren't just a rebuke, they were an invitation to change. When the plane landed, Eastwood stood to leave, retrieving his carry-on with a deliberate calm. As he passed, he paused, looking the businessman directly in the eye. "Take care of yourself," Eastwood said, his voice steady, his tone free of malice or judgment. The businessman watched him walk away, the simple words resonating deeper than any lecture. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a challenge to be better. As he exited the terminal, the businessman opened his phone and typed 3 words: "Be like Eastwood." It wasn't just a note, it was a promise. Because sometimes the most important lessons come in the quiet moments, when someone holds up a mirror and forces you to see the person you've become.